right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming out this evening, everybody. Greatly appreciate it. I am Eugenia Gibbons. I'm the co-chair of this advisory committee. And you are now in the third in a series of public engagement meetings and open houses that we have hosted. And we're really glad to have you here tonight because our focus of the discussion is going to be on kind of where do we go next? What do we do next? But before I run through sort of a summary of what we've covered before, I just want to turn it to our mayor, see if you have any thoughts.
Oh, a bunch, but I'll try to keep it on task and focused on the issue at hand. First and foremost, I want to thank all the members of the Public Safety Building Committee for an effort that's gone on for more than a year now. These are folks, professionals, public safety professionals, but really the heart of the work has been done by a tremendous group of volunteers, and that is the way good things can happen in this community. We've talked a lot about the need already, and I hope at this point, given the number of tours that have been made available to the public, that there isn't much question about the need, and we can get into the real meat of the solutions that are out there and the costs associated with it. So with that, I'll turn it back to Eugenia, and looking forward to the program.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to help set the context a little bit for the conversation that we're going to have tonight. As Mayor Brodeur mentioned, you all as members of the public are very familiar with the need that is before us. Our public safety buildings are outdated, they require code updates, they require modernization, and quite frankly, they require investment that can carry them into the 21st century, so our police and fire personnel can provide 21st century services. We're all in agreement that that's kind of where the conversation starts, right? That we need to make that investment. What we have been doing for the better part of a year as a committee is digging into the details to try to understand not only what is this need, but what is it going to look like for the public to have to respond to the need and rise to the challenge of making this investment. And so as a committee, we have really tried to do our due diligence to present as much information as possible, all of the information that we have gleaned over 18 months of working together, the work that we've done to dig into the work of our predecessors, a previous committee, to pick up the pre-design work with Doreen Whittier, which you'll hear about later, to gauge from the public what are some of the questions that you all are grappling with, what are some of the answers that you're seeking, and ultimately what we are doing is working towards packaging a final report which we will present in June to the mayor and to city council as well as to the public. What we are not doing, and I think this is really important for the public to understand, as it was something that we as a committee really came to agree upon, is we are not trying to pit investments in public safety against other necessary investments in the public space, in the community. We know that we need to make investments in things like schools and in other municipal buildings. But the way that those investments get prioritized or sequenced falls outside of the scope of our committee work. So that's really important to know. It's just sort of like level setting. The other thing that we really wanted to make sure that people understand is that this challenge is not unique to Melrose. Communities across the Commonwealth are facing these very needs and having to come up with a response and the ability to invest in solutions that meet these growing needs. We're an old state. We have old buildings. We have a lot of communities that are primarily comprised of residential tax bases. So we're not unique in that sense. But what we will need to figure out is how do we uniquely rise to that challenge and respond to that call. The third thing that I want folks to walk away understanding tonight is that we're presenting our best estimate based on the work we have done for the last 18 months of how we are likely to need to proceed. But the numbers that you'll hear tonight are not the final numbers. They are not exact. They are as close to exact and as precise as we were able to get to, given the resources we had to undertake pre-design work, and the time that we had to try to come up with the final recommendation. Those numbers, when we presented them earlier this spring, will continue to be refined and be tightened and become even more precise should the city choose to move, I'm going to say when the city chooses to move forward, because I really hope it's not a question of if, but when the city chooses to move forward with this investment, the first phase of that, as Emmanuel and Glenn will explain, is the actual design work. And in that process, we will get very precise numbers. So those are the three things that I want to kind of ground tonight's conversation in, right? Lots of places are facing this similar challenge. We are not trying to pick winners and losers or pit one project against another. We recognize that there's going to need to be some prioritization and sequencing that happens. And we are far from finished. This is the starting point. This is the place where we as a community are beginning this conversation in earnest to work together to figure out how we want to move forward together to meet this need. So with that, I'm going to open up our slides, or ask Elena to open our slides, and I will turn it over to Emmanuel, who can provide, you can go to the next slide actually, who can start us off with a history.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Emmanuel Andrade. I'm a resident, Melrose resident. I live in the Wyoming neighborhood, Old Corktown. And I'm a member of this committee for almost 2 years now. And my expertise is public construction, design, planning. I do exactly this type of work at the state level for courthouses, community colleges, public safety, buildings for the state government. So I just want to start with a quick recap from the last meeting on April 29th. And just to share that the stations that we have today and the police station that we have today are not the original fire stations and police stations of the city, of course. What we have today is version 2. Version 1 came when City Hall had a police station. Before Central Fire, there was a smaller, older station across the street. Before Engine 2, there was a smaller, older station right next to La Cuchara by the train station, and before Engine 3, there was an older, smaller station at the same location. So what we have today is version 2. And like in the past, it's not working anymore. The stations are far too small, and they no longer can provide the services that the police and the fire department need. So we're proposing version 3, and that's what we're presenting today. So I just want to share this slide to say that we're just repeating history, right? This was been done in the past, and it's been done in a span of 70 years. It took 70 years to get all those stations replaced. And what we're proposing today is to, again, replace 3 of those stations. We're going to renovate 1 of the stations, and we're planning to do that not in 70 years, but in 7 years. And that's the plan today. Next slide. So with me I have Glenn from Dorian Whittier, but before he presents, I want to share one slide of committee planning guide principles that we adopted before we brought Glenn and his team on board. These are things that even before we had the architect in the room with us, we planned to have these principles that the committee would abide to. And those are principles that were location agnostic. Even before we're talking about a certain location, we have these principles. And the first one, it was pretty clear from the previous study that the current police station cannot stay in the same place. The building's too small, the lot is too small, and the police needs to continue to provide services during construction. So the first thing we decided, we need to find a solution somewhere else. Eventually, we found a new site, or there's a preferred site, which is the Ripley School, which was presented at our last meeting. Number 2, I talked about history. Here's history again. For 120 years, over 120 years, Melrose has had 3 fire stations. You look at the map from 1875, you can find all 3 fire stations there. This committee is not planning to reduce the number of fire stations for many reasons. One of them is we don't want to impact response time. So the last meeting, someone asked, what will be the response time when this effort is completed? The same as in 2023. No combined public safety building. That was something that came in the previous effort. This time around, we're being very clear that there is not a single municipal parcel in Melrose that is big enough to handle a building big enough for the fire department and the police department under one roof. So right off the get-go, we decided that is one principle that we're going to follow. The fire department cannot cease any operations in any of the fire stations, or we have to find a way to keep the fire department going, right? So the plan is to avoid construction for an extended period of time at every single fire station. And we can't keep the fire stations going while we have construction. It's just too much work and too much personnel and too many trucks to be doing all this, to have a construction site and a functional fire station. And the last one is that we're trying to do this for the next 50 years, right? There is a community north of us who did this 20 years and they didn't do it right. And 20 years later, they're going back to the community asking for more money for additions and more work. And we're trying to avoid that. Next slide. This is the preferred location for the police station, south the border with Malden. It was released at our last meeting, and it is the best location owned by the city that we have at this point. Next slide. And just to finalize, at the last meeting, we presented the our preliminary phasing. We know it's going to be 3 phases where the new police station and new engine 2 would be built at once, while the police station remains in operation. Then phase 2 would be engine 2, Tremont Street, and phase 3 would be engine 3 by Melrose Common. Next slide. And our preliminary numbers shared last month add up to 96,000 square feet. These are 4 modern 21st century public safety buildings require. It's a much different story from the feasibility study from 2017, which is about 55,000 square feet. That is completely unrealistic. Next slide. And, the big information at our last meeting that this would cost, preliminary numbers, over $120 million. So Glenn is here today to share the refined numbers and the refined, not only the refined cost estimate, but the refined phasing for this process. So this is the 5-minute recap from the last meeting and what we're seeing today. And with that, we'll have Glenn explain the next slide. And we can do this together, so it's not just you.
No, thanks, Emmanuel. And Eugenia, I think you guys did a great job setting the stage. I don't feel like I need to say much more. I'm Glenn Gallrad from Dorn Whittier Architects, one of the senior project managers. I also happen to have been around for the 2017 study that we did with the previous group. Very different approach, very different outcome, as is pretty obvious. I think generally, before we get into some of the sausage making of the plans and the costs and the timeline, perfect. That's a good background. Thanks, Elena. I think it's important to note that among the various things the committee dealt with and tasked our office with, really started with listening to the departments, and both chiefs and their staff put a lot of time and energy. We asked an awful lot of questions. And in fact, we start the process with a questionnaire. 95, 100 questions that were distributed among both departments separately to the staff that the chiefs felt were important to answer. And that gave us the original foundation, the place to start from. Questions about spaces needed, operational specifics, characteristics of day-to-day function, shift changes. All these parts and pieces come together to start giving us the building blocks for making these buildings. With the schedule behind us. It's an intense couple of years. I think it worked out. But what are the couple things to touch on? The key thing, I think, with the process that we've sketched out is to minimize the need for temporary spaces. You folks probably dealt with swing spaces for schools. It's exponentially more expensive to house police, fire, the apparatus, dispatch. If we had to deal with a temporary dispatch center, that's remarkably expensive. And those temporary components, you don't get back. It's money that you're not getting anything except a means to an end to get the other buildings built. So the phasing works out. Police, frankly, is a little more straightforward than fire. But build a new police station, they move in, the old building is decommissioned. With fire, I think after weeks of discussion, it made most sense to take the Tremont Street Engine 2 building, relocate the staff and equipment to the two buildings not being worked on at first, and find some space to store a couple of apparatus, a couple of the fire trucks. But in the meantime, the chief and his staff would figure out how to keep operations running smoothly while that building was completely vacated, torn down, and built anew. That works really well because that ends up being the biggest facility and ends up being the swing space for the next two buildings. So not only does it serve the needs for that part of town for the fire department, it can pick up some of the slack during the next two portions of the project, which then start picking up speed. The central fire is probably the crowning jewel of this project. We've loved and adored this building from the beginning, but it needs help. With that Tremont Street building completed, the fire department could move pretty much all the assets out of there that would be needed to cover that part of town as well as the northwest. But give it the love it needs. And I think we'll get to the diagrams at some point. I'll try not to spend too much time here. And then the last part of the project being Engine 3, a little more straightforward as well. Now that you've got two new updated fire stations, that becomes a little easier to get done. There's room for all the staff and all the equipment in the meantime. And again, the goal is to save all that money. That there are potentially millions and millions of dollars of temporary facility costs that are avoided. But yeah, the goal is in the next 7 years to get this done. So this is where it gets fun, right? I could talk about money and financing options and all that stuff till you literally fell asleep. But this is where it's exciting. And where those questionnaires started, this is the next step. We take that raw data from the questionnaires and we dump it into a spreadsheet, and then we start grilling both of these departments, weed out any redundancies, refine it, get to a point where we can build these conceptual adjacency diagrams. And then we go back and forth and maybe we'll find a few more efficiencies or redundancies and clean those up. The goal being to really find the right size. These are not Taj Mahals, they're not opulent, overdone. They're really refined, at least at pre-design level, as much as we can get all the data captured, truth tested with what a building might look like in terms of its plan and arrangement. And most importantly, we get to then have the dialogue with the departments. Right now, the police chief has given us some great feedback, and before this report is memorialized, we'll incorporate his comments. Same with the fire department. But this, for a police station, we have a very particular set of design challenges, going from green spaces, which are the more public-facing side, to the other end of the building, which is the detention and processing and evidence storage and the real nitty-gritty of modern policing. And the goal, in a way similar to fire, is to separate those functions, to separate things like hazardous materials or other oddball evidence and to keep the staff safe, and honestly to keep the detainees safe as well. It's important to cover both sides. But in the new plan, there are spaces like a meeting training area in the front, the core in the middle of dispatch and roll call and day-to-day operations, and again, the evidence processing and detainees on the opposite side of the building. No, you can go to the next one. With the bulk of the administrative functions, aside from the front door, happening up on the second floor. Detectives, the chief and his staff, archive records, and a lot of the mechanical and server spaces would get on the second floor. It accomplishes a couple of things. Keeps the footprint not a whole lot bigger. If it were the Ripley site, the building isn't significantly larger in footprint or mass than that existing building. It will look very different. It will feel different, obviously a different function, but just generally thinking of the site, it's not that the intent is to dwarf the neighborhood or to fill it up. It'll fit well. Next slide. And separately, if the entire project is put together, we've got a pretty efficient firing range that happens as well. These are really all the function is the form is what it is. It's a hardened facility. We settled on 4 lanes that worked well for the police department. And it's a discussion point. It's something that's very important for police to maintain certification and familiarity with their equipment. And there's really no better way than to do that hands-on in your home station. The state resources for certification for range time are dwindling. There are more demand on them. Less communities are building firing ranges. It's a tough thing to get done. These guys have to scramble for space and time for certification, traveling further and further, I'm sure. Next. So up now onto the fire department. I know red is probably a good cue, right? But this is the existing site up at Tremont Street with the footprint of the building and a very simple diagram, site analysis showing where the setbacks are for zoning and what the buildable space looks like. In the new building, we pretty much fill up the entire site just to get what they need. This is a fairly tight program for the equipment and the staff and the operations they need to run out of this building, including a maintenance bay with the equipment needed in a small office for a maintenance tech on the far left. But similar to police, we want to separate the public front door clean side, the green and the lighter colors, from operations. The absolute critical piece of fire station design is maintaining the separation between not only the trucks and the sort of dirty gas and oil type stuff, but the toxins they're bringing back into their living room essentially have to be left down here. And so a key piece is up at the rear left of this plan, is what we call it. It's a decontamination suite. It's a number of spaces where, imagine coming in covered in crud. You take that gear off, you rinse yourself off, and you gradually go to a cleaner and cleaner space. And as a diagram, that's pretty much how the building is organized in general, from cold or not hazardous zones to hot zones, and really maintaining separation, not only walls and spaces. The mechanical systems are dedicated to do that. So the equipment supplying air to the dirty side is completely independent of the equipment that supplies air to the clean side in the living quarters. And this is a 3-story building to get everything on this site. So we went from the first floor previously up to the second floor, which is effectively the living room, right? This is their place to eat, sleep, study, write reports. And it's, as you can see, it's pretty full. This is not an elaborate or an overbuilt design. We get the number of staff they need. And I guess I should make sure that it's clear that we have designed and found what we think with the fire department is the right size. We've got about 8 to 10% growth considered in all the projects and all the buildings. So it'd be easy to make a case to do more, but it'd be hard to make the case to fund much more than that. So again, the key, you're gonna hear me say the word right size. I think it's really important we strive to find that right size that's reasonable in the big picture for the community, but meets all the needs of the departments. So the third floor in this building is a training room, emergency operations center, and some room for growth, as well as a lot of the mechanical equipment would be up on that third floor. What we like to try and do is, since we already need 2 stairways, we make one of them a little bit larger than typical, and that allows it to be built out of hardened materials, and the staff can train in there. They can do all kinds of harness and technical rescue practice right in the building. I'm not sure if we got into the details about throwing water inside or not yet, but we, as the designs progress, we would refine it with that sort of information. But okay, so that was Tremont Street. It's keeping me going here. I appreciate that. As I noted, the big goal is to get that building done, and then the fire department has some breathing room. They finally got some room to put equipment and staff, and then we get to central fire, which we tried, but to meet building code, energy code, the structural upgrades that building will need, it's a risk category 4 building, so it's a hardened building that has to withstand all but 500-year catastrophes. We found that we needed to add a small piece on the rear. So this plan is oriented towards Main Street on the right, the parking lot to the rear on the left. And so we end up with a new front door, back door, front door. But that would be the full height of the building at the rear. We want to stay away from the historic facade out at the main street. But it would tie all the way up to the 3rd floor with a new elevator, a second stair that's required for egress, and all the service spaces we could shoehorn into it, because I can't recall exactly, Chief, but we probably had to offload 6,000 or 8,000 square feet of space that you needed in here, but we could not fit. So it's been distributed to the 2 other buildings. So at the ground floor, again, Main Street still has the trucks coming out the front doors. That would be a restored facade. We've worked with Mass Historic on a number of projects, and we understand what they'll allow communities to do and what they frown upon. And this is a pretty straightforward process. We wouldn't, obviously we're not proposing to expand left or right or out in front, so we get some leeway at the rear, which really helps. Among other things, I think it'd be important on the 1st floor to lower the 1st floor slab, right? This is where the trucks are going in. They're very tight now. The undersized, low cellar space, I don't know, I'm sure between photographs and, I don't know, Chief, if you brought anyone down there. Our gut instinct and our approach at this level is to assume that gets filled in, demolish the entire 1st floor slab, fill in the basement, and pour a slab as low as we can reasonably get away with to gain the height on the 1st floor. And similar to the other buildings, you'll see the decontamination equipment, the turnout gear and operational storage. It's tight here, but it starts to give them a little breathing room when you've got the space to put all the gear. Next slide. On the 2nd floor, it's a packed house. This is again the living quarters, the dormitory rooms, the kitchen, the day room. And towards the rear, we've put a small fitness area in. And again, that rear portion behind the blue line is the new. And so that's where the elevator and mechanical and all the infrastructure stuff will come up and down through the building. Next. And on the 3rd floor is where as much of the administration as we could fit goes, including dispatch. This is a trickier diagram plan to work out that I think what we'll find during schematic design is a little bit more efficiency. We'll be able to refine these spaces, understand really what we can build under the pitched roof and how much of that footprint we can build to. But it's got all the offices, dispatch, and support spaces needed for the servers and the radios to run the department. Okay, next. And then engine 3. This, there was clearly the need for a much larger facility than is there now. I guess what was interesting in the whole process, right, I can't recall, Chief, 7 or 8 meetings it took to start to understand how to distribute all the different spaces and operational needs among the buildings. It was interesting to see what's needed here. The building can be done, intent is to have a 2-story building, a little different than Central Fire, right, which is a historic building. I think we envision Engine 3, the Tremont Street building, as a more contemporary, not utilitarian, but municipal modern building. This needs to fit into the residential neighborhood around it. And I love the idea that the fire department wants to keep the access to a public toilet. It's right there across from the park. And we need to provide those anyways. So perhaps having a side door to the toilets for off hours that's an easy thing. That doesn't cost any more money, and we have to build them anyways. But 3 bays for equipment. Same kind of organization, except in this building there really isn't any administrative function. There's no dispatch. It has the redundancy from a computer server and radio standpoint to be able to do that in a pinch, but that's housed at Central Fire and at up on Tremont Street. So as you go upstairs, I think you can probably imagine that that's the living area. And I think one of the things that was a question early on in the study was to see if it was possible to add out and on to the existing building. And structurally, the amount of space we needed to get on the 2nd floor was just too difficult. You'd end up building a building around a building to make the new building, if that makes sense. To Eugenia's point, unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, when we're asked to look at old buildings for reuse and adapting them to modern buildings, it costs more. It's more expensive to intervene and make it stay. But so again, this is a 2-story building, separated from operations on the ground floor to the living and other functions upstairs. I think that's all the diagrams. Oh, we do propose having a little bit of a basement in this building, simply to have some of the mechanical and storage space. Because it's such a tight site, and the intent to keep the overall massing and the footprint reasonable for a residential scale neighborhood.
Great.
And real sausage making. And I think both Emmanuel and Eugenia touched on what I think is very important. At a concept diagram planning level, the costs reflect that. They're very conservative. They built an awful lot of unknowns and contingencies into them. And even with those industry best practice conservative numbers, as we saw during COVID, and back in 2008 and 2009, things go up and down in a way that over the duration of this project may be of an impact, but we can't see the future. What this does, this breaks down the 3 phases on the left side. It goes through the 3 phases, the first being the new police station and Tremont Fire. I could keep going, I know it.
Keep it going.
The
I was
second,
going to try to zoom in so
Yeah,
folks
that's
could
okay.
see each individual.
We'll make all of these materials available on our website so you can pour over them in your
Right.
spare time.
That's a good way to put it, because there's an awful lot of detail even at this conceptual level. But I think generally that's the goal. When you layer in the escalation, which is the inflation over the next 7 years, that's how these numbers are derived. I don't know if we need to get into the dollars and cents for rebuilding, but I thought it was important to also note that when you see a construction cost, that's how we start building the soft costs, right? The designer fees, the geotechnical, the survey, the permitting, and the radio propagation studies, and all the things like furniture and computers and chairs and beds. That typically ends up being 25 or 30% in addition to the construction cost or hard cost. So that's what the totals are built on, the construction hard costs plus the soft costs, which in this case on a longer duration project include the escalation. So, but where we got to at this level without doing any value engineering or seeing how things could be phased or perhaps built as add alternates, which are, you know, maybe the maintenance bay is a good example. That project, we could have the base bid be the main building and the maintenance bay be an add alternate. So if bids come in at a good spot, then we can afford the bay. Again, we're not here to make those decisions, but that's just an example of how that number can start to get broken down. But that represents the bulk of what we did. I think the building committee did a nice job, I think, taking this stuff and running with it.
Which is a good segue.
Yeah.
Which is a good segue to the last and final, the next and final slide for the pre-design, which is we took all the good information that Dora provided us at $138.8 million for 3 phases, 4 buildings. Slide number 11, please. And so we're making some concessions and basically recommending that perhaps as a starting point, we don't build the fire station, the firing range at the police station. And that has a savings of a few $1,000,000. So if you click on the next one, instead of being a station that is $36.4 million, it's now $32 million. And then we had two value management items added to the fire department, which is maybe we don't build that maintenance bay and maintenance office at Engine 2 at Tremont Street. Maybe later, if there's more money, that can be built after the fact. And also eliminate $1.5 million worth of swing space or temporary quarters, and maybe the city will have a good idea of perhaps using the operational budget or finding an location at no cost or little cost to store equipment. So if we remove those 3 items, a project that would be in 2023, the cost of phase 1 would be $68 million. Now it would be $62 million in 2023. Of course, we can't start in 2023. We would start in 2025, and the escalation is $68 million for phase 1 now. We have no value management recommendations for phase 2 or 3. Everything is in phase 1. So that total of 138.8 now becomes 130, and that's what the committee voted to recommend to Mayor Brodeur in our report, $130 million. So last time I was here on end of April, I said 120, over 120, and today we're saying it's 130. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenn and Emmanuel. I'm going to pivot us now to the question of how do we make this happen. So we covered what needs to happen. I think it's really clear that we have tried to arrive at what is the optimal solution. As Glenn said, this is not, we're not like building the Taj Mahal of public safety buildings. Not to say that our first responders don't deserve that, but that's not what we're building. We're trying to optimize space, be as efficient as possible with costs, with space, with meeting the needs. We're really trying to let the needs of the 2 departments drive our thinking, our design, and our commitments. But at the end of the day, it still has to be paid for. So we're going to turn it over now to Mayor Brodeur and to his staff to walk us through how these things get paid for. But I just think it's important to note a few key pieces. One is capital projects such as public safety buildings are usually financed over a period of time utilizing a mechanism called a debt exclusion. The costs are not offset from state funds like a school facility. There's not a pot of money that's going to materialize from the feds as part of implementation of recent bills or anything that's going to make these things somehow less than what we've presented. It really does come down to the ability of the taxpayers to absorb some of these costs over time. These costs are outside of Proposition 2.5, so it is separate from that. The debt exclusion is a separate mechanism. And then, as I noted, they're costs that are spread out, they're paid annually over a period of time. So if you can go to the next slide, I don't want to jump. Am I stealing your thunder, Paul?
Well, this is a much more readable, concise version of what I have.
Okay, so what we will go into is the mayor's office was able to provide a model for what this might look like, what it might actually look like when it hits a resident's tax bill. I've only put up here the first 7 years, but I will note, and as Mayor Brodeur and his team will go into, after 2031, those costs look the same, pretty much across the board for the duration of time. But what you see here is if this were to move forward on the timeline that Emmanuel and Glenn mentioned, then by 2025, we'll start to see some, actually, I'm gonna let you explain it because I don't wanna misspeak.
Thank you, Eugenia. You pretty much have it. So there's probably two questions that folks are interested in. The first one, hopefully, is obvious. Why a debt exclusion? Why don't we just borrow under the way we borrow and service that debt with our operating budget? We try to target no more than 5% of our actual operating budget as debt service payments. Obviously, the higher that goes, the less you have available on a fiscal year by fiscal year basis in order to cover actual city operations. And Catherine Armada from the Treasurer's Office is here, if need be, to give you some precision about what our capacity is. We are right up against our 2.5 levy limit, so there's not a lot of wiggle room like you might hear about in some other communities where there is capacity still within 2.5 to pay for things like that. So, as Eugenia mentioned, Proposition 2.5, which I hope you all know is a state law that caps a municipality's ability to raise more than 2.5% in additional tax revenue, property tax revenue, from one fiscal year to the next. The good news about that is it makes the math really easy. Property tax, for the most part, from a citywide perspective, is tremendous because you know almost exactly what you're taking in. Unlike capital gains tax or income tax that is dependent upon whether or not folks have jobs, whether or not they've realized capital gains, property tax comes in, unfortunately, regardless of your ability to pay. But that's what makes it so stable. So there's two possibilities under Proposition 2.5. One is what we did a few years ago, which is what I'll call a traditional override, which means you're adding money that can be used for operating budget. That is, a function of, again, all subject to voter approval, and in my opinion, several years ago, recognition that our needs were outstripping our resources to serve those needs on an operational basis. A debt exclusion, as Eugenia mentioned, typically for an important capital investment, particularly for towns that don't have a lot of growth, a lot of opportunity to generate new revenue, they tend to be very big ticket items. This is obviously a big ticket item. The only other time I believe we've done this was for the middle school. The good news on that is that debt is scheduled to come off the books in 2029 and really substantially in fiscal 2028, and then there's some cleanup money. A long way of going around the block to saying for something that's this expensive and that is an extraordinary expenditure, we need to find the money from somewhere outside our operating budget, or we're not going to be able to continue the level of services that, in my opinion, the community requires. So what does that mean? Just so you know, I think Emmanuel, maybe, or Eugenia, you very graciously said it was the mayor's team, and that is that is true, but we have a terrific partner in that we have an outside securities and banking firm that does all our banking and assists us with things like these estimates. They work on debt schedule to give us a good idea of what the timing of borrowing would be, when we borrow particular chunks or tranches. They're sometimes called, and that gives us the roadmap for how much and when we take it. And then the assessor's office and the treasurer's office, the treasurer's office takes these things out to market so we can actually get the money. And the assessor's office is then tasked, along with Hilltop Securities, in figuring out essentially the hit over time. So that type doesn't have anything to do with the actual planning. The assessor's office, the treasurer's office, they don't weigh in and say, why don't you take that off, why don't you add that in? We give them a number, along with Hilltop Securities, and they work the number. So that is essentially what this represents. What most people want to know, quite reasonably, is 130, 100, 160, that is a somewhat meaningless number, right? You want to know, what am I going to have to pay and how long am I going to have to pay it? So what this demonstrates, if you don't mind me getting up, as you'll see, the numbers are low but growing. That's because, I think as Emmanuel said, we don't borrow all at once. We borrow when we need the money. There's two kinds of borrowing. There's a short-term borrowing and long-term borrowing. That's not super important to this matrix. But basically, if we start out not borrowing too much, we obviously have to start paying back immediately. So the impact early on is pretty low. Now, that having been said, I'm not here to bluff anyone or not tell you the stone cold and challenging truth, where this is where we're living. Plus or minus maybe $20 as some variations occur. This is the impact, and it'll be the impact for roughly 30 years. 30 years, once it gets going, is typical borrowing for significant capital outlays, for obvious reasons, because you just can't draw that much money and start spending. There's no good reason for that. So this is where, obviously, the more it costs, the more this goes up, the less it costs, puts downward pressure on that number. And that is really the next part of the conversation. I think folks want to be assured that they're getting value for their money. And it's kind of a, I don't want to say it's a double-edged sword, but there's two competing propositions here. We want the most reasonable value. To Emmanuel's point, we don't want to go back 5 or 10 or 20 years from now and start from scratch or invest significant new money into these facilities. We want something that, again, that's going to stand the test of time, last for at least 50 years. But we don't, by any means, work with a blank check. These are real dollars that taxpayers throughout Melrose will be paying, and their descendants will be paying. This is 30 years, right? It's highly unlikely I will be writing a check 30 years from now to cover this bill. We'll see how that goes. So this. Oops.
Sorry, I just was gonna. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So this is a little bit more detail in that it shows essentially when we'll be borrowing and what the cost impacts. This is this tranche idea where we're starting out with these two buildings. That would be the initial and largest borrowing that we would do, and then a year later, again these are rough estimates. A year later, we've got to borrow for the next piece of the project, and then finally, a couple years after that, we'd be borrowing to do engine 3 under the plan as it's described. And this essentially draws a very, very big picture. So this is the reason why we have this average impact at 733,465 is because that is the average value of a home in Melrose as we sit here today. this is per $100,000 of value, so you can get a sense of, no matter what the value is, kind of where this thing lands. The reason why we have existing and projected debt up here, again, this is what we call exempt debt, flows outside of 2.5, is because for the first few years, we'll be carrying the end of the middle school plus the beginning of the financing of the public safety project. So this includes, if you go way back to column A, can you drag that over? Blaine, can you drag that over? Where it says existing excluded debt service, that's what the city actually writes a check for. If you ignore existing excluded debt service and write middle school debt there, it's a little bit clearer. That is the tail end of the middle school financing. And that, obviously, as we said, that comes off in 29. As you can see, it's kind of the rounding off in 29, the significant payments in 28. Obviously, as we go through this, based on all the decisions we make, that'll affect the delta. And we can show, I don't know if the numbers say that, we can show you on a fairly granular level, like what do you, I'll say save, how much less do you spend by skipping the firing range. Easy to quantify under this model. Again, the finance piece of this is easy to draw. It's not easy to write the check. I understand that, but it is pretty easy to value and plug in and take out things to analyze the numbers. So from a process point of view, the way the process works, again, these guys, the committee will put together a report, issue recommendations to me and the city council. I put forward something to the city council, then the city council can essentially do with it what it will. They can endorse the existing report and put that to the voters. They can change it and put that forward to the voters, and they can also, I'm just speaking theoretically, they can also put nothing forth to the voters if they don't think it's the right time or the right opportunity. I certainly hope that is not the case, because going back to the beginning of the discussion, the need is crystal clear. The facility, if you go back to the original slide, if it's possible, of the 4 buildings and the dates. Yeah. Oh, no, that one was fine. So our newest building, again, Emmanuel, you correct me if I'm wrong, when the SBA helps you build a school, they expect you will project out 50 years of usage, right? Probably something of the same here, contemplating not necessarily a tear down and a rebuild, but these buildings evolve over time, and you can't realistically expect 50 years from now to not have to make some significant investments to adapt to the reality of modern firefighting, modern law enforcement. Now, as you can see, the baby of the bunch here was born in 1964. It's when I was born, so I can tell you very quickly that is 59 years old, and that's past its prime. I will say this, it's the best of the bunch, and I don't think it's particularly close. But if you take 1884 off the chart, this could almost literally be a picture of the building from 1895. Not a heck of a lot has changed in terms of the basic structure. Obviously, the nature of the services and the equipment has changed. And same thing with the police station, where, again, it says 1950. That's when that station, just to remind folks, that's when it became a police station. That's not when it was built. I don't recall when it was built, but it was, memory serves, a Mobile building, a phone company building, for several decades before that. So again, the need is crystal clear. Again, clearly we're not sugarcoating the cost, because if we did, we'd have a much lower number to present, but those are kind of the nuts and bolts, rather than continue to blather on. Happy to take questions.
Perfectly timed. So we are going to turn it over. We have a half an hour left to do public questions. I'm sure you have many. But again, I just want to quickly wrap up some of the points that Mayor Brodeur and others have made. So again, as you just noted, the need is essential. We really have tried to let the needs of the department drive our deliberation. We are wrapping up our final recommendation based on what we hear tonight, what we heard over the course of 2 weeks of open houses, and at our last meeting, we will prepare a final report that will be presented to the mayor and to city council mid-June. And again, we are really looking to accomplish, we are not underestimating what this ask is of the public, and we are not trying to downplay it in any way whatsoever, but we are trying to help the public have all of the information and go into its considerations with eyes wide open in the way that we have done, because we recognize, as I said at the beginning, this is a long overdue investment. It is long needed. It is not unique to Melrose. Many communities are facing it, and quite frankly, we don't have an option to not act because there is tremendous expense associated with deferred maintenance and, God forbid, something really catastrophic happening with one of these buildings. So with that, I will turn it over to the public. I think we have mics. We have
So we're going to use
one of these.
one of those.
I'm happy to walk around. Hold on one second.
I'm really loud.
We have to record it for posterity.
All right. I'm usually quite loud though. All right, so I actually have 2 questions. The first one is we looked at the cost per homeowner. Is that per homeowner only when we do a debt exclusion, or is that per property owner? Because we do have some commercial and industrial properties, and would they be impacted by the debt exclusion, or is it just homeowners in Melrose?
Great question. The short answer is not everyone who's a property tax payer pays. Which one should I grab? Because this mic is MMTV and this mic is... So, terrific question. For those of you who didn't hear it, the question is we've broken this down in terms of impact on residential property owners. That includes condos and any kind of residential dwelling, single-family home, two-family, condo, apartment ownership, not necessarily the rent payer, but obviously that's probably going to be something of a passed-along cost. Commercial and industrial owners do also pay, and they pay at a little bit of a higher impact because we do what's called a shift. So not everyone pays the same, but the reason why we're projecting this is because the overwhelming majority of property owners in Melrose are residential, and that is where where kind of the heart of the debate is, but we can project out for anyone. It's a terrific question, though.
Okay, and then my second sort of question or comment, I understand the need to possibly refine the plans for the police and the fire to make it a little bit more palatable, taking away from 140 million down to 130 million. But my understanding was that there's a cost that we are incurring on a quarterly basis, I think it is, where the police have to, by mandated law, go to firing ranges and practice on the firing ranges, and so then we pay other communities. My understanding was that if we had our own firing range, not only would we not have to pay those other communities 4 times a year, but we could also then get income, anywhere between $350,000 or $500,000 a year. Now, if that was the case, of course, that money could be used for the regular maintenance, upkeep, whatever, of the police department, but I also then wondered, could that offset a smidge of the cost on an annual basis? If we had a firing range, then we can use it, not have to pay out, and then we could also bring funds in.
Another great question. So really, it's just it's fairly simple analysis in terms of return on investment, right? Those sound like pretty good numbers. They sound a little bit optimistic to me, but I have no idea. We don't pay a ton of money to rent, a facility, but we certainly pay more than zero. And that's part of what we take a look at as we further refine and break down the numbers. Absolutely, if we can get, it's all a value proposition. If we can realize a good return on investment, we'll be crazy not to do it. Haven't quite gotten there yet, though.
Yeah, and I think the important point for everybody is that the debt exclusion is determined not based on projected revenue that we could get from something like that. It's based on the cost of the project. And also, I meant to highlight this earlier, if you look at the slide column page, wherever it was, so what you're actually looking at when the other debt falls off is about, based on these numbers, about $120 more than what you're paying in the absence of this, compared to what we're paying now. Where's H? Here it is. Where's column H? Behind Glenn's head. I just want to point this out because I know the number, you hear 130 million, you're freaking out, but it's not a massive leap from 650 to 870. It's a big leap in that first year, but then as Paul noted, you're hanging out around that 870 number. So I just want to flag that too, sorry.
We finished paying off the Lincoln School, and next year we finish paying off the Roosevelt School. I was told that's like $140 a year. And also I was told during the override campaign that we were getting $250 for rent from the BB. The library will be finished off next year to move back into its home, and we can rent the BB back out. Why wouldn't we take, when one building project such as the Roosevelt is done, and take that $140 in the BB rent, and that's pretty much $400 a year, and put that towards the police station, and mark that for the police station, and maybe even one of the fire stations, and that would, I would think, offset a lot of this cost. Moving one building to another.
Not my particular area of expertise, but I will say those were done obviously inside Proposition 2.5, meaning we didn't go outside for it. That does free up other money. We also have significant other needs. Those aren't huge because honestly, those were fairly cheap projects in current dollars, and the debt service isn't a ton. We certainly can, but it is not going to be, if you can go to projected debt service over here, I'm going to assume your numbers are good. Well, our debt service, when it comes out, is in the $8.5 million a year, so certainly something to take a look at, but it's not going to move the needle in a big way.
And I would add, I think another way to consider that is these projects aren't happening in a vacuum, right? So I mentioned earlier that we have lots of municipal needs that we're going to have to think about, building and facility needs, maintenance that's going to happen. So while those costs might not go to offset the cost of this project, they're still going, those resources are still going towards other projects, other needs in the community. And I think that's also important to have a whole picture.
If I could put a little bit of a finer point on that, because the little piece of good news, at least from a planning perspective, is historically, it's fair to say we maybe could do a better job in terms of our capital, meeting our capital needs, not at the major project level, but paying attention to and tracking some of the smaller things that we do pay with regular inside of 2.5 borrowings. And so anything that is capital that's over $1 million or so, we consider going out to market borrowing. We still want, as Eugene said, we still want that capacity. We are in the process of finishing up a partnership with our friends at the Collins Center, which is a UMass outfit, to put a longer-term plan and start thinking about what is the funding mechanism for that, so you can see kind of how all those needs, and it's very aggressive in the sense of it's designed to be very forward-looking, so you will see things like that we will need Chief, when do we need our next ladder truck? Because we just bought one.
Oh, about 15 years.
So 15 years. How long did it take us to get this one?
From construction to design to taking it about 2.5 years.
2.5 years. We expected it to go quicker, and the cost was like $1.25 million.
About that.
What we're learning is that's going away, for particularly on the major fire equipment and apparatus side, costs are going up, and the time of procurement is going up. So we're actually, if current trends hold, we're going to be in a position where when we buy our next pumper, we're probably going to have to order it sooner than we actually need it because of the nature of the marketplace, where you're buying right now like 3 years before you actually want to take delivery. So we do want a cushion in terms of our normal borrowing to keep up with some of those needs.
Hi, thank you. Monica Madero Solano. I have a question, two questions actually. One is, what is the interest rate that this is factored in at? And then the other question is just, I was hoping to hear from the committee why they decided to take the firing range away, what they must have had a discussion about that and why you chose that.
So I will let somebody else answer the interest question. We haven't actually had a discussion about eliminating the firing range. Have we? We did? Oh, up there, okay, sorry. So Emmanuel, you can speak to why it was. Apologies.
Yeah, I'll do the interest question because it's short and sweet. So again, I mentioned there's two types of borrowing involved in this: the short-term, so-called borrowing authorization notes, estimated at 4%, and the long-term borrowing, kind of the meat of the borrowing, we're using 5% as a number. Again, right as we sit here today, very, very conservative, mindful. Again, that's a place where, if we're lucky or if the market is favorable, there's potential savings there because the interest rate won't be as bad.
So regarding the decision to make a recommendation to eliminate the fire station, it's all based on cost. We thought that at $138.8 million, it was pretty clear that the first item that could potentially go would be the fire station, because the firing range behind the police station, because it's a detached facility. They're not connected. It's not the same building. It's basically a second structure behind, and perhaps something that later, if there's funding available, could be brought back. We're not saying eliminate the firing range forever, but we thought, our committee thought that was the first value management recommendation. So with the firing range 130, without the firing range 130, with the firing range 134.
Yes.
Jim O'Loughlin, Lincoln Street. Could you pan over to the right-hand column, please? Thank you. So as I understand this, the average homeowner in Melrose right now is paying about $200 a year on debt exclusion. Is that true?
Yep.
So that really means that the increase on this, when everything settles out and the middle school's paid for, is $674, not $874 of what people are paying now. Is that a fair statement?
In terms of out of pocket, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So while we're waiting, I've got I'll answer this gentleman's question.
Sure. Did you have, oh,
Go.
go ahead.
Me first?
Yeah.
To give you a sense of the level of interest in the project, the gentleman, I won't read the whole letter, but a gentleman who said he couldn't be here tonight had this dropped off at my office, and God bless him, did put some thought into it and talked about a combined public safety building and why aren't we doing that, and included a picture of the Harwich combined public safety building, which is pretty good, because we again just didn't make it up, he put some thought into it, and he's just curious, quite reasonably so, we've covered this before, why not a combined public safety building? And Emmanuel already addressed it, but I want to make it clear, because the space needs as developed by the committee with the cooperation of police and fire just can't be met at that site. And what the gentleman was wondering is, why don't we just keep going back, essentially? There's plenty of, I would leave it to the engineers to give a precise example, but my understanding is that the further back you go in that area, the more challenging it gets to actually build. That essentially is standing water is a lake, or has been a lake, so to build on there, you're talking about significant increases in cost to engineer without necessarily getting super value. Is that fair to say?
Yep.
Beautiful.
I just want to confirm the location of that example. Is that Harwich in the Cape? Is that the city with 12,000 residents? Yeah. It's possible in the Cape, perhaps, but Melrose just doesn't have a parcel big enough for something like that. And the previous effort from 2017, the mayor is right. The proposal to have a big addition behind the central fire is just it's too much. It's a landlocked site. We can only approach it through Main Street. There's this de facto driveways between Central and the City Hall and Central and Memorial Hall. It's already squeezed, and the thought of adding a huge building and lose all the parking that is available behind the site. We just had the parade Sunday organized in that area. It's just not possible. Not possible in Melrose.
Hi there. The question that I hear a lot is the assumption that we have to have 3 fire stations, and what is that based on? And did we actually look at response time data, and have we compared Melrose and the number of fire stations here with other communities with population 29,000, 4.5 square miles, and how do we get to the assumption that we have to have 3 fire stations?
Perhaps Chief Colina would be willing to speak, but before, let me just mention that as a committee, we have decided that as a planning principle that I presented in the beginning, to not reduce the number of fire stations for a few reasons. One of them is, history. We have had 3 fire stations for quite a while. But also, let me ask you a question. What is the closest fire station to your house? Yes.
2 blocks away.
Which one?
East.
Engine 2. Engine 3. So let's say the committee decides to propose that engine 3 will be gone. And God forbid there's a fire in the neighborhood, a tragic fire. This committee does not want to be responsible for being the entity saying we are the ones who recommended that fire station be eliminated. So
There's another fire station 4 blocks away.
Yeah.
From the same house.
Get rid of Central.
right.
That's the question that I just hear. We've got to sell this, I think you've got to have a good answer for why a community this size needs 3 fire stations.
Yeah, and we'll let the chief respond to that.
Yes, thank you. So our response time, we're hitting the NFPA standard of hitting target areas less than 6 minutes. And we're doing that 91% of the time. And, we live in a dense city. It's 4.5 square miles, but there's probably closer to 30,000 residents that we serve, and many, many structures, probably close to 14,000 residential structures. So I could be off on that. And we have our stations spread out through the community to reduce response times. And if you were going to eliminate a station, which one would you eliminate? Well, the people that you're talking to. And it's not just house fires or building fires, it's medical aids. And, you know, when someone's heart stops, you have really 4 to 6 minutes to try to get it beaten again with some aggressive CPR for that patient to have a viable chance of survival. And by the time the fire department gets called, the event is already probably at least a minute old. So response time is very, very critical. And, you know, we respond to well over 8,000 responses a year, and we're hitting most of our responses within 3 to 4 minutes under a 3-station plan. Eliminating one station will drastically alter that and certainly cause more damage to our structures. But more importantly than that, it will have an impact on the survival rates of people that are in medical needs. I hope that answered the question.
We have about 10 minutes more.
Hi, thank you. I didn't have a chance to look at the plans before. My name is Michelle Dixon, but just a couple of questions. I did the public tours last week. For the new fire stations, I know in the main street, on the second floor, there's an office, and I apologize, I forget the name of the office, that is open to the public. I don't know if it's licensing inspections, that's not accessible. So I'm hoping in the new design that is relocated, because it's difficult to have something where people are going in from the public and there's no elevator and you can't access it. So that's one of the things that stuck out to me. The other more general comment is I'm hoping for both buildings there's consideration for sort of separate women's bathrooms and showers. You know, I think at the time the buildings were built, there weren't women. But I know, for example, in the police station, there are 2 small showers and women have to use them with the men. So I think it's just important thinking about those kind of demographics and making sure there are separate spaces. And then the last comment is I did feel a lot of concern in both buildings about some of the hazardous conditions. And for example, in the police station, I was in an office where there's a desk literally with asbestos falling on it. And they said there's sort of a joke about who's going to get mesothelioma first, but I don't think, it's not funny. So I'm wondering, in the phasing in, is there going to be some kind of temporary remedy or addressing some of the, lack of air circulation or asbestos or anything that our first responders are facing in terms of harm? I know that's a lot, but those are my general comments, and I thank you for all this. One last thought, is there anything that Melrose would be eligible for based on new materials or anything green or climate, or I don't know if anyone's looked at anything that could be like an offset or a grant or a pilot program for any of these buildings? Thank you.
You're talking my language now. I think there's a couple of easy ones. All the new facilities would be fully ADA and MAAB compliant, no question. And that's one of the huge costs that would be associated with upgrading the existing buildings that we can obviously mitigate by building new. The gender separation, that's another great question that's evolved quite quickly in the last couple of years especially. We almost never build facilities, police and fire now, with group showers. We do certainly separate men's and women's locker areas, but most of the time we have single occupant bathrooms, so a sink, a toilet, a shower. And honestly, we leave it to the departments. We meet the code. This Massachusetts state code still requires a certain number of men and women's specified rooms. But honestly, we leave them gender non-specific. Honestly, it's an easier, more universal way to approach it. But we check the boxes for the code, we check the boxes for the staffing needs, etc., and leave the designations to whatever they may be. Grants. We are obviously asked at every project, what can a community do to find money to help pay for these things? There's not much. I think the mayor touched on MSBA type process. There's a huge amount of money the state puts up for schools. For years, there's been a program rumbling around the State House. Even before COVID, it was moving slow. It still hasn't progressed much further. It's not off the table, it's still slowly being discussed, but a similar type program to what the MSBA does for schools has been talked about for years for public safety. It's not there yet. I talk to my local rep all the time to see where it's going, what can we expect, and it's still TBD. But I know the chiefs are typically really good, their departments are really good at getting grants for things like equipment and training. That's a little easier to come by than grants for actual infrastructure. I'm sure citywide that's probably the standard MO. The last part, hazmat, that's a question. I think in the previous study documented the hazmat such as that we could without doing destructive testing, which would expose staff to more, which we don't do, but our hazardous material consultant did an extensive survey of what was there. If there are actual materials, friable material or whatever, we have not gotten to the level of specifying remediation of that, but that's something that can be done as soon as it needs to be. I wouldn't wait on that. I think those are the 4 things you touched on. Did I get those okay?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
We have time for about 2 more questions. We have 3. We'll do 3.
How you doing? Well, Siskin. So we were talking about the fire station layouts and how we have the 3 of them. They have allowed for rapid response, which is great. The location proposed for the police station, the Ripley School, it's a good space, but it seems far out for a police station, way out there on the border of Lebanon near the cemetery. And I was just wondering if, and I don't remember if maybe I touched on this when I went to the tour, if there were any other city-owned spaces that had been considered, or if there were any other spaces in Melrose in general that had been considered that were not available, but might be made available in other ways. Can you clarify on that?
I can answer the easy part about the location and perhaps its importance relative to response or other sorts of things. Thankfully, police almost entirely respond from in the field. Right? They're not having to put on gear and run out the door into the truck and out to the site. So that really alleviates some of the location specificity with the police station design. Is it nice to be in the center of town? Sure. But if it's a site that's available and doesn't cost millions of dollars and is suitable, then it's a strong contender.
You nailed it, for sure. You know, we were governed by suitability and price, probably in that order. And certainly the city has eminent domain power, so we could theoretically take anything. That's an expensive and it's an expensive proposition that takes a lot of time. We own the Ripley School site. It is a terrific size for the police station, and there's no nice way to say it. It will also take the Ripley offline, which is very, very close to the end of its usable life. For us to keep Ripley online would be a very expensive proposition. But the most important part of it is what do the police feel like they need. So I'm going to turn it over to Chief Follier to talk about that.
Thank you. Just to reiterate, sir, so as far as response time, we're a little bit different, a lot different than the fire department, where we don't, in theory, in an ideal world, we don't respond from the police station. The only time our officers are there is change of shift, roll call, getting their cruisers, getting their assignments. But when they get their assignment, they go out in the street. We have 3 primary sectors, and that's their office, that's their space. So in a real world, in an ideal world, as a chief, my men and women should be on the street responding to calls. So as far as response time, it shouldn't have any effect. Again, it's not ideal. I'd love to stay in the middle of town. I joked around earlier. I love all the meetings that I go to at City Hall to see the mayor and the rest of his staff, and I'd walk there. I go to Brugge's and I walk there. I'd walk downtown. Yeah, I'm not gonna like not being able to do that, but you kind of take what's the best option of what we have. And I think geographically it might not be the best, but geographically it's also the best, meaning the space is great. The corner lot is great. There'll be plenty of parking for our cruisers, plenty of parking for the community. It's a quiet area in a sense. And I also mentioned in another meeting, I think they're used to construction with that neighborhood, with all the blasting they did up there. You know, if we have to do that again, it's not as, you know, it's easy for me to say I don't live next to there, but it's probably not going to be as intrusive as maybe other locations if we had to come in and just for 2 years have trucks upon trucks going in and out of whatever alternative site we could have. But I think it's actually, it is the best solution that we could come up with.
I will commit to bagel delivery. Get like a 5-year bagel deal going.
I just have a couple of questions in regard to where the police station's going to be. But have we communicated with our butters in Malden? Is that going to be any kind of problem with their concerns? And there's a lot of ledge there. I think you said something about blasting. Is this something that's going to be concerned to the immediate people? Because I know where I lived, there was some blasting a few years ago, and it really affected a lot of the property in the surrounding area.
I don't know if anybody else wants to answer. At this moment, that outreach hasn't begun because it's only a site that's been identified as a prospective location for a new police station, but I don't know if there are other.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Specifically, we haven't gotten to the level of detail to determine how much rock would have to be removed. Ideally, it's not blasted and just hammered out with a big piece of equipment. The design, for sure, would minimize the amount of work we have to do removing ledge. It's expensive, but compared to taking other properties or purchasing something anew, it's not a bad deal. And even in our concept diagram plan, it looks like a lot of the edge of the site by the cemetery is relatively flat, so that helps with the parking and some of those more open space types parts of the project. But for sure, if there is blasting or heavy ledge removal, the contractor would be required to go in and document all the neighbors' foundations and driveways and hardscapes, just to be sure that there's no impact from the project.
Great, so this will be our last question of the evening.
Thank you for the latitude. I know we're past time. I just need to, I think it's important to go back to the issue about the 2 fire stations. I think that's probably going to be a place where a lot of people are going to stick on. And just going back to the 2017 study, there didn't seem to be a degradation in service. I mean, obviously to the immediate downtown if you close the central fire station. And the other item that came up, and I'm not sure, there's no stats in any of the materials. It seems that we do a lot of medical aids versus fire. And I'll be candid, because we've always had 3 stations doesn't land well with me. We used to have 3 pumpers. We don't. I have hardwired smoke detectors in my house. We have a lot of renovation, a lot of new build. Compared to the amount of time we have mutual aid for medical emergencies versus fire, that stat would be helpful to share with the public. And actually, in the 2017 study, actually contemplated putting 2 rescues at engine 2 and engine 3, or just thought about, we should think about that. So I think we need to do better at understanding if we're going to land on 3 fire stations, don't lean into history, and maybe you might need to answer these questions. Thank you.
That's a great question. I think you asked a similar question at the last time, and it's important, it's a good reminder that we need to lift up the fact that the 2017 study didn't actually look at how to optimize space in order to meet the needs of fire. So we are constrained by the fact that one of our largest buildings is historically designated, as Emmanuel has said a few times, at the local level, the state level, the federal level. If you think eminent domain is hard, I mean, I wouldn't want to navigate those 3 designations. So that means that we are left with having to add the space that is essential to provide fire services in 2 other locations. The work that has been proposed for Central Fire is, quite honestly, to bring it up to code, to make it habitable, to make it functional. not to expand space or give more space to provide additional services. It's to recognize that that building's not going anywhere, it serves a purpose, we need to have it be code compliant. Therefore, the other two buildings are where we're gonna have to make up for the need for space. And we will definitely, you make a good point, we need to make sure that we articulate that clearly in our report. I think the draft sort of heads in that direction. But it is not purely a matter of, hey, historically we've always had 3, so let's stick to 3. It really is, if we are committed to providing 21st century services in this community and actually being able to be responsive in the times that are required to maintain certification and credibility, and if we are to have the space that is needed to provide those services, then we're gonna have to find a place to put them. And as we've already talked about, we don't have a ton of space in this community to build. So the way to do it is to add 2 engines 2 and engines 3. And that's the difference. But it's an excellent question, and I thank you for raising it. Are there any other questions before we wrap up this evening? I want to, oh, there's one more. Okay, one more. While I'm walking over to you, maybe I have a future as a talk show hostess. While I'm walking over to you, I just want to note that our website address is on the board, as is our email address, and I encourage folks to please send your questions, additional questions to us. We, as a committee, are available to answer them.
Hi, I'm Jean Zink, and been in the community quite a long time, and it's a wonderful community. But what I wanted to know is, you mentioned at the last meeting about putting it on the ballot in November. Could you specify how that would be put on the ballot in November?
Sure. It's a terrific question. It's actually, and I would say, it doesn't have to be in November. There's a little bit of cost savings by running it with another election. But the city council can set any time they want for a debt exclusion or an override, I'm pretty sure. Essentially, the language will be drafted for the city council to discuss, and it's not particularly complicated because most of it is set out in law, what you have to say, and essentially says, shall the community authorize borrowing for the construction of 4 public safety buildings under the scenario, and then that is the question that goes forward with a yes or no response, and it's majority of folks voting required to pass it, and if it passes, we build, and if it doesn't pass, I'm not sure, we have to think about something else to do because the problem is not going away. But that's the probably too long answer is city council controls access to the ballot. They're the ones who can put it forward for a vote.
And I guess I would just add that all of our timelines are contingent on going forward to the ballot in November. If we were to not move in November, then the timelines that were presented would be further delayed, and we'd have to revisit, timing, cost, sequencing, those things. So our study is based on the assumption that we would see the city move forward in the fall. With that, I'm going to close us out and say thank you so much for joining. I don't think we had any questions online. Okay, excellent. This meeting will be made available online. As I said, our website will load all of our materials to the website. Please email us. I know if anybody has more questions, please send them our way. The next time you'll see us is as a committee. We will be presenting to City Council in early June with our final report. So thank you. It's almost June. Mid-June, I believe June 20th, I think is the tentative date, but it'll be posted publicly. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you all very much.